All right, so today we're just going to have a conversation about trauma-informed care with considerations for promoting early social communication, really thinking about for those of us who work with children and how can we support them and really take a proactive lens or approach to helping children in whatever work we may do. So um, Katie and I have been, this is our third talk now, and we've just been trying to think about things that could practically inform our practice across disciplines. And so we're very happy to be joined by Lisa Vaughn, who's going to also chat with us about trauma-informed care. And so just to jump right in and into this conversation, it's something that I hadn't given a lot of thought to in my personnel prep training. It was stuff that was touched on, but not something that's really was ever a direct focus. And I feel like I see more and more information about it. And that doesn't mean that it wasn't there before. It just, I think what's happened is that people who do this work are trying to keep bringing it to the forefront because it's so important. So first, when we think about let's talk about what is trauma. When we talk about trauma, like I hear that and I think of a million different things. So if we think about trauma and whether it's direct or indirect trauma, what does that mean for us when we hear that term?
Lisa, I'll let you take that. What trauma really, what the definition of trauma actually is.
Sure. And I think when we talk about trauma, there are so many different definitions, but I just think about adverse childhood experiences. So they're, especially in the context of children. So, so many different experiences that could happen, whether that's witnessing domestic violence, being in a car accident, being a victim of sexual assault, emotional abuse or neglect. There are kind of macro level traumas. We're all experiencing the trauma of a pandemic and the changes that we undergo as part of that. There are natural disaster traumas. And there are traumas where parents may have been incarcerated and in and out of the home, or primary caregivers. Maybe the children have been removed from the home. So I always like to use the adverse life events scale to kind of look at, how folks may have experienced different traumatic stressors. In addition, there's lots of, kind of talking about those macro level traumas. Again, we have race-related stressors or stressors that folks that may have experienced secondary to their faith. So we can see those kind of play out on that macro level as well.
Okay. It's interesting because I was trying to do some research or did some additional research preparing for our talk. And for young children, I was surprised and I guess not surprised at the same time that it said, across different studies, the estimates I think have written here, 25 to 50% of young children have experienced some type of traumatic event in some capacity. I know that can be wide reaching and their definitions vary, but they've even included things like living in poverty, neglect, and things like that. And so I think for me, when I hear trauma, I think I automatically always associated it with abuse of some kind, like physical abuse or emotional abuse of some kind. And so it was fascinating to me to read all the different facets or variations, like you mentioned. There's a variety of things that anyone can encounter, but think about focusing on how we support children. It really was eye-opening to think about of all these little kids running around, like the extent to which they've experienced some form of trauma. And so I guess for either one of you or both of you, either through personal experience or what from training, how does in general direct or indirect trauma, so indirect if a child observes abuse versus receiving abuse, how does trauma in general impact a child's life? What do we, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about some other considerations, but just in general, what do we as practitioners and researchers need to be aware of that we're dealing with in this sense?
Real quick, I want to throw in to the definition of trauma and the types of trauma. in terms of the kids we're specifically working with, kids with disabilities, particularly kids who are non-speaking communicators, are drastically more likely to experience trauma, including abuse, including disability related abuse, and also non-abuse related trauma, including medical trauma. So, like a lot of the kids that we see may have spent a long time hospitalized, or they may have been in the NICU for a really long time. And that's a form of trauma as well. And just like an example, I was working with someone once and trying to sort of outfit them for an AAC device. And I went and I was getting a stylus to use for the AAC device, but it was in a plastic bag that kind of looks like one of those medical, hermetically sealed plastic bags. And when this person saw the bag, he like ran over to the corner of the room and like buried his head and wouldn't look at me. And then his mom kind of explained, like, this is what I think is happening. I think it's from medical trauma. Like he's just had really, tough experiences in a medical setting. And it's like, wow, I had no idea. And so, just like so much trauma that specifically impacts the populations we're working with that we wouldn't necessarily think about or aren't necessarily trained about.
Well, that's really, yeah, that's really interesting. I think about, that makes me think from my side of things. I'm thinking about, how we observe and measure behavior, and even thinking about challenging behavior, and how these things that, like seeing something such as that plastic can be this neutral thing, and then it becomes paired with, this traumatic event. And then, which in turn, like later on when I am in that same situation in the future, how did I escape, or how did I avoid this, or how did I get out? And I think about that, and I guess it's really that, what do I do in that moment to avoid or escape that situation? So, right, that's an interesting approach, and I wouldn't have thought about it that way. I guess in then thinking about how it impacts a child's life, Katie, that was a perfect example. And Lisa, did you have something you wanted to add to that? Just general consideration of this is what we see or what we should expect.
In my experience doing a lot of ADHD evaluations or learning disability evaluations, like that's the biggest piece for me, is trying to piece some of the hypervigilance that you might see with trauma from some of those like fight or flight responses. Whether that looks like impulsivity for ADHD, or that looks like restlessness for ADHD, or is this actually, a trauma response that's just biologically based? Are what we might consider a problematic or a target behavior, is that actually related to this fight or flight response? So the child that's running in the room hiding, in Katie's example, that sounds a lot like, we would say, oh, he's non-cooperative, right? But actually this was a trauma response. And so the language that we use to describe what was happening for this child is very different based on whether or not you're looking at it from a trauma-informed lens or not.
Especially if you're talking about non-speaking communicators, behavior in some cases is the only way they have to express, this doesn't feel good, or this is scary, or this reminds me of something that was really awful. But like I had another teen I was working with who I was talking with his mom, and she mentioned someone that had been mean to him before. And he just ran out of the room, and he was just sort of like running around the clinic. And I think that there is a temptation in that situation to be like, to be kind of like forceful, like, no, you're misbehaving, or you're uncooperative, or non-compliant, which is just a word I hate. But like working with his mom and knowing his history, we were able to say, oh man, that must have felt really bad. Obviously, I'm not a psychologist, but like just trying to show some empathy and say, like, if you need to walk, we'll walk. If you need to be away from the clinic, we'll be away from the clinic. We'll talk about something else. We'll do something else. And then he just, I just like, I don't know what to say. Obviously I'm not a psychologist, but I just said, we don't have to talk about him anymore. You are safe. I care about you. Your mom cares about you. You're safe here. And he just like gave me a big hug and just started like sobbing. And then, the rest of the session, we were able to, do some stuff, some, speech therapy and stuff like that. But also that really helped me to build trust with him as his provider. And I think that if I had tried to handle that in a like, trying to make him compliant kind of way, I think that would have broken our trust and he would have associated me with something negative.
That
So
makes total sense. In hearing this, and I think about, I know not to jump ahead, but just even thinking about, for maybe not even interdisciplinary lens, but just respect for other thoughts and approaches. I think sometimes from taking a behavioral approach or behavioral perspective, some people may miss, we don't discuss the why as much, right? We don't discuss the theoretical sides of things. And I think what's important, and I've been having these conversations with students and other people lately, and because I've, worked with some great people and hearing about, these things don't have to be mutually exclusive. I can have an understanding of, how trauma is defined and what trauma looks like. And that can map directly onto understanding the science of behavior because, when we talk about the science of behavior, it's just these principles or truths. We know that if something pleasant follows a situation, I'm probably going to engage in behavior similar in the future, same thing. So I think it's a matter of, no, we're not all always speaking the same language, but knowing that we can map all of these things on top of one another. We don't have to understand everyone's perspective on everything in the sense of professionals, but I think respect and knowing these things don't have to be mutually exclusive. And that's what's important for me in hearing this and having a different lens about this and how we can, so people just don't shut down when they hear these different phrases. Well, that's not my field. That's not mine. So I'm not listening. So I think these things
I
are
wonder
important.
if like maybe almost putting it in a like, and I don't know, I'm not a behavior analyst or a psychologist, so excuse me, but I almost wonder if there is some overlap, in terms of like, okay, if we're looking at the antecedent to the behavior and is the antecedent, some type of trauma, and then, from a psychologist perspective, how would you help de-escalate that trauma response, and like you said, those two things don't seem like they are mutually exclusive. It seems like combining them, gives you more power to, address something in a well-informed way.
Yeah. I think we're only as good as the teams we work with. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like the more diverse and broad the team, I think that it's only going to make things better. But so I wanted to just jump in briefly in, as before we get into multicultural considerations, when we talk about trauma-informed care, and Katie, I had the great pleasure of collaborating with you on a poster presentation about this topic. It was for non-speakers, but the notion of safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and then considerations of cultural, historical, and gender issues. So, a mouthful for sure, as I just read that list, everybody. But, we think about those 6 things and, so we have these buzzwords and things we think about, but if me and Lisa, I'll direct this to you at first and then Katie or whoever, if you were to kind of break down what it means to take a trauma-informed lens or trauma-informed care lens, what does that look like for us in general, regardless of the field or discipline we're in?
And I think that kind of touches a little bit on what Katie was saying in terms of, obviously, from a psychologist perspective, we're always interested in the why. But, you don't necessarily have to know a why, for other areas. There can just be and is, right? So like we know that responses happen. I think particularly about things like a lot of people like to use the word manipulation when talking about behavior, and that's one of the ones that I really hate. Is that a child is manipulating you, or and so understanding when we're trying to get our needs met, which is what we're all trying to do in this world, is get our needs met, and that may look different depending on which discipline and depending on what kind of traumatic stressor there was, and knowing that some behaviors that even seem more adaptive, we might think are adaptive, can ultimately be things that are may maintain the trauma response. So for example, children who are a little more friendly than might need to be with an adult that they don't know well, or things like that. So kind of, they're trying to get that person to love and appreciate and meet their needs in a way that doesn't respect their own personal boundaries or those kinds of things, due to trauma. I hope that's kind of making sense. But, knowing that some of the things that we may reward people for may kind of reinforce a trauma response, and, helping them teach like bodily autonomy and their own choice about things, that they don't have to hug me because they think that that's what I want from them, but their own kind of choice around their body and what feels good to them. And so I think the same is true of those behaviors that a lot of times we would like to change or to modify, or help them get their needs met in different ways, to not be seeing that as, like an act of choice in order to manipulate us or upset us or to quote unquote get their way. I tend to think that if we believe that most people are doing the best they can with what they have and coming at it from a lens of everyone is trying to get their needs met, we just need to identify how to help them do so safely, and with autonomy, then I think we go pretty far in any field.
Yeah, that's great.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really interesting perspective, like to think about trauma-informed care in general, and how we apply these things to the kid, and thinking about for these young, with mapping that onto young children who traditionally have, may not use speech, and which is oftentimes considered the most straightforward way of communication, even though there's a variety of ways. And Katie has taught me about the importance of, or really emphasize the importance of multiple modality and things like that. But how we really empower and support and consider trauma, again, from a lens that isn't, it can come in a variety of ways. So Katie, did you have anything to add as far as kind of those core principles of trauma-informed care?
Yeah, I just want to kind of add on a little bit to what Lisa was saying, is that, like, at least I think this is what you were saying, that sometimes behavior that looks quote unquote bad is really just trying to get your needs met. And sometimes behavior that looks quote unquote good is not necessarily good because you're not necessarily respecting your own boundaries. And one thing that I've read a lot in terms of reading accounts from autistic adults and their experiences with all kinds of therapies and education and schooling, is the concept of quiet hands. Like, you need to have quiet hands now, like no flapping or stimming. And that oftentimes forcing quiet hands on yourself or forcing yourself to stop stimming actually makes it a lot harder to concentrate on what's happening, to listen to your communication partner, and can also be like, can negatively impact self-esteem. And like having to do that, on a regular basis all day, every day, can also be traumatic in itself. So I think it's important to think about some of the things we're asking kids to do. Are we asking them to assimilate, or are we asking them to do something that's going to ultimately empower them to become more independent at getting their needs met, like Lisa, you were saying? And so I think it's really important to try to avoid the assimilation, because I think that can have the opposite effect in terms of being traumatic in and of itself.
Yeah, that's great. And it reminds me of conversations we've had too, directly related to that notion of, what is this quote unquote ideal that we're trying to map children onto, and it's so contextual, but we take it as this approach of, kids need to look like X, Y, and Z to fit in. If they don't fit in, and so I think that that's an important consideration, and using that as kind of a transition into thinking about multicultural considerations of, we talked about different types of trauma, and it's, you've all talked about a little bit, but types of trauma that children with disabilities may encounter. And then I'll just go ahead too, and, thinking about, types of trauma that in conjunction with children who are, Black, Indigenous, persons of color, that, trauma they may encounter in the intersection of that. So just to go ahead and kind of open up that conversation, for us, what are those multicultural considerations we need to take into consideration when, working on challenging behavior or teaching new skills or promoting, communication, whatever it may be?
I think it starts even just with your room or your setup or your supplies. And I think those are things that we don't always think about. But toys are, culturally bound. And so, some of those are triggers for some people, for some children, certain types of toys or certain presentations of people. So, police officers can signal some stressors for other people. So can, if you have refugees, so can other types of, people in uniforms or those types of things, kind of building on Katie's story, people in the medical field. So toys that you have or stimulus that you have that, feature those things, and also making sure that you're featuring your own a representation of different types of toys, different, types of um, dolls that look different and that, aren't one homogenous kind of group. Those are things that we haven't traditionally been good at in our, at least, I can say that in the psychology field. I won't speak for your all's fields. And at the same time, like also knowing that just who I am can be a trigger for a lot of children. Just being, a white woman is going to be a trigger for many folks. And that can come with lots of different kinds of ideas about who I am.
And so you would say that those are all excellent points in practical application. So if we're thinking about, the trauma for someone who's Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, then, really thinking about that seems to encompass potentially racial trauma the individual has experienced in their life. And so if we think about racial trauma and then any trauma children with disabilities may encounter, what are some things that we need to think about then or be aware of as types of trauma that individuals can experience then? So if you have a disability, let's say if you have a disability and as a person, person is Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, what do we need to look for? What do we need to be aware of in that sense?
I would like to say something, and hopefully maybe Lisa, you know a little bit more about this, but in terms of behavior and how behavior is interpreted, behavior particularly of Black and Latino students is more likely to be interpreted as negative and not like adaptive. And so, Black and Latino, especially male students, but also female, are more likely to get labels of like oppositional defiant disorder or emotional behavioral disability when really they have maybe a language disability. And whereas white students with similar presentation of behaviors are more likely to get less stigmatized labels. And then, when you have the more stigmatizing labels, also data show that you're more likely to experience what could be traumatic disciplinary actions, including removal from school, maybe removal from school into a home situation that's not that great, or maybe removal from school into an alternative school system, which is also traumatic in and of itself, that in and out inconsistency. And so I think even just from the very most early diagnostic perspective, we're already setting some students up for the potential of experiencing more traumatic events in the institutions, educational institutions and therapeutic institutions.
Wow.
Absolutely. Yes, there's a lot of research to demonstrate that, children who are Black or Latinx are much more likely to be diagnosed with things like oppositional defiant disorder, and, to be treated more harshly in punitive practice. I mean, we all know that. We know kind of the pipeway to prison kind of mentality that schools sometimes have. And then you add in other kinds of features like a language difficulty or, any other type, who may be autistic or things like that, then they're much more likely to be met with harsh discipline or to be met with like the school resource officer coming. And it's, almost the worst thing. It is the worst thing you can do, is to bring the school resource officer in when you have a child of color who has, in general, first of all, but especially who may have, other kind of language needs or other traumas.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely eye-opening and such, as far as, things that you think you're aware of, and then, or I can only speak for myself, things I think I'm aware of, and then you hear additional things and you just think, gosh, I have so much more to learn to support and just be a better citizen
Oh,
and
absolutely.
professional in general. So, I want to take a few minutes to think about, interdisciplinary applications. So, we're talking about young children, we're talking about children, in the sense of there's potential intersectionality given potential traumas and their experiences. And we're trying to promote this early social communication. And then how do we, and I challenge myself with this, conduct assessment with the trauma through a trauma-informed care lens, and provide service delivery, whether that be in education, behavior analysis, speech language pathology. What do we need to take into consideration? So I always think about, what's the practical implications for us? What do I need to do a better job at considering trauma-informed care in my assessment and practice? Lisa, what do you think?
I always start with, anyone can give like the adverse childhood experiences scale or get that from like a parent. But it's the ACEs, and it, kind of looks at experiences that people may have had. And I think, I learn to try to give that regularly. I mean, obviously we do a lot of that in clinical interview, but it's also, I think, important just to know the history, and to know, asking parents or caregivers or teachers, like what those triggers seem to be, and, identifying what they may look like. I think the other is, giving the child the ability to, um, making sure they understand that they have choice and voice in what we're doing. That's a huge one, because when we're talking about an assessment that we're supposed to get done in 50 minutes, and we've got 47 things to ask in 50 minutes, sometimes we just need to recognize we're not going to hit all those, sorry. And we have to give the child choice and voice in terms of, do you want to talk about this first or this first, or, also the ability to pass on some things. But just because you're ready to talk about their trauma doesn't mean they are. And so I think those are major ones. As much as we can kind of know that walking in, is really important. And, the biggest one for me, because this is something that obviously I'm still growing and learning, is I've got to know my own biases and my own, that's, if you haven't started there, start there, because that's your biggest thing that's going to like cause a disruption in the relationship with your student or with your client, is, the ideas around that we have around the microaggressions that we demonstrate, the culturally biased language that we use, the culturally biased materials that we use, even, questions that we ask that are culturally loaded.
The culturally biased evaluations and assessments that we use.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So know the psychometrics to that. I'll be honest, that was not a question when I was in graduate school. Like it never occurred to me that the assessments that I was using are culturally loaded. And they 100% are.
Oh, yeah. For speech pathology as well. It's like, even when, it's an assessment that, they've tried, I always say, that, an assessment can try its best, but you can't completely remove cultural bias from an assessment, period. And so you don't want to rely only on a standardized assessment for a diagnosis. But that's a whole other conversation. I think a big takeaway for me from what you've said, Lisa, which is something that I feel like you put it in words that I have never thought of it in this way before, but just the idea that there's not bad behavior, that everyone is just doing their best to get their needs met. And I think that coming into a therapy session or an evaluation with that attitude, I feel like just is a game changer.
Absolutely. I've worked kind of my area for therapy later in life has been a lot of complex trauma, especially for adults. And it's a lot harder as adults to kind of come in and change patterns of behavior that we've had for this long. And most people, the behaviors that we're calling manipulation or non-compliance, or all those labels that we like to add, those kind of in our mental status that we check off in each session, are just people trying to get their needs met. And whether that's because they've learned to shut down and not talk, or they're freezing because I have triggered something, or they're fawning and showing me all the good qualities that they think that I want to see from them. And you got to be careful about buying into that one too. Or they're in fight or flight mode. And, obviously those are the ones where those kids are at the most risk for being re-traumatized.
Okay. So what I'm hearing and I'm thinking about from a practical application sense is we want to have awareness of an individual, the triggers associated in the sense of past trauma and avoiding re-traumatization. Would it be correct or incorrect to say in the sense of if I'm going into an assessment or working on a child's social communication, so we're playing together, we're using things, it's awareness of the environment and how I set up the environment, and in the way making sure I'm informed in some capacity from family or whoever it may be about this has been this individual's experiences in life, and maybe then what I need to do is consult with someone else about what are ways I can avoid that re-traumatization, in that sense. I'm trying to think what can, because I want to make sure that what we're doing, when with that family or student is being respectful and supportive. So would you say that's an appropriate approach to take, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the realization that we're not going to be able to do it on our own. So, one discipline isn't going to be able to solve everything. So like knowing the equal parts, right? That's a great time for consultation, where if you have a child that's demonstrating a behavior that seems confusing to you, and that child, has some speech language issues, maybe having both the school psychologist and the speech language pathologist kind of put in some of that input into like what may be happening, and how to resolve those things.
That's great.
And just as like someone who's working school-based right now, I mean, I'm just going to say that like the people who are like on my quick email list are the school psych, and anyone if there's someone who works with behavior, but yeah, mostly the school psych.
That's awesome.
And we have some school psychs too that also have a behaviorist background, so that helps too.
So Lisa, do you, just to as we wrap up, do you have any resources you recommend for us to think like, hey, this would be a great thing to listen to read, whatever it may be? Do you have anything?
I would say there are lots of great things out there, but if you haven't started with like the adverse childhood events, like that's kind of the research study around it is, foundational. And so I think starting there. And then when you're talking about trauma-informed care, there's the entire kind of trauma-informed care network. They have all kinds of resources, like in terms of collaboration. Obviously, I'm most familiar with it in terms of psychology, so like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy or other EMDR, those types of things. So, I would say that those are the ones that I'm most familiar with. And there's lots of folks out there who are doing excellent work related to multicultural work. So if you are in healing racial trauma, I would say that the work of Stephen Nifley at Spalding University is really foundational, especially for Black men, but also just racial trauma in general. I know the UK also has Dr. Candace Hargan-Owens. And so, there are a couple of different resources there for the trauma-informed care perspective, related to racial trauma.
Great. Thank you. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with us. I feel like I always learn from any conversation I have with anyone from another field and such, but I always, just want to say thank you for taking the time to do this.
Thanks for having me. It makes me want to develop like toolkits, right? So what are like your last question? What did you say?
I said, will you please do that?
Sure. I think that could be a great collaboration in terms of what are our toolkits for, how do we work across these different phases? I think, if we could just reinvent our different approaches. But again, I can't emphasize how much that starts with the individual person.
Well, I'm glad that, I'm glad Katie and I have been doing these talks and collaborating on this, and I feel like we always, I can't speak for Katie, but always learn from people. So I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, I feel like I always learn from these, and Lisa, literally every time I talk to you, I feel like I learn from you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. This has been a lot of fun for me, and I think also helps me think about it from an interdisciplinary perspective. We can all get very, very insular about our specific subject area. And so thinking about how to cross those disciplinary divides is really cool. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Thanks again.